Okay, class, the next chapter we're going to review is chapter 8. And this chapter was all of the reforms in the 1800s. So we're talking about like religion and ending slavery, alcohol, education, and all of those things. So I guarantee that as I go through this, a lot of this will come back to you. So let's look at number 23 on your study guide. It says, what was the Second Great Awakening? And just be aware that the Second Great Awakening was a religious movement in the early 1800s. And what you need to know about this movement is that Americans became what we call today born again Christians. So if you see here, there's a picture, right? You have a preacher. He's really emotional. He's pointing, right? And you have all these people like listening to him, and basically deciding to start their life over again as Christian. So in the first half of the 1800s, you had a lot of Americans becoming born again Christians. So let's move on to number 24. It says, what type of Christianity expanded during the Second Great Awakening? And that's kind of on our same slide here. Make sure there's two ways to name it. You can either say born again Christianity for number 24, or you can use the more formal name evangelical Christianity. Both are correct. Both are the same thing. Okay, let's move on to number 25. 25 says, what two specific churches expanded the most during the Second Great Awakening? So I'm not just saying born again Christianity. What two specific types of churches? And the answer to this one is the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. So you have a little chart here. And on this chart, you see between 1820 and 1860, the two colors that are the biggest, like representing the most new converts, are green, Baptist, and blue, Methodist. Okay, so for number 25, make sure you have Baptist and Methodist. Okay, so once everyone became Christian in the early 1800s, that had a big effect on people's views regarding drinking alcohol. So number 26 asks, why were women leaders in the temperance movement? And I gave you a little reminder on your paper, like the temperance movement is the movement to get people to drink less alcohol. So make sure you know that women were the victims of alcohol abuse, and they were the ones who dealt with the negative financial effects of alcoholic husbands. So the economics of drinking too much, the finances of drinking too much, and the physical abuse of alcoholics. That led women to, they wanted their husbands to shape up and drink less. So this is a very famous picture. You have a group of women, and they're saying, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So women were really passionate about the alcohol issue. Number 27 says, was the temperance movement successful? And what I mean by that is, did people drink less alcohol as a result of what these reformers argued and what they fought for? And the answer to this is that the temperance movement was a success. When people were warned about the dangers of drinking too much, what happened in the 1840s and 1850s is that there was a 4 times decrease in the amount of alcohol consumption. Prior to the temperance movement, it was acceptable. People drank alcohol in the morning, in the afternoon, at night. They would black out, all sorts of terrible things. But then after the temperance movement, people stopped drinking liquor, and people started drinking weaker forms of alcohol, and people just started thinking about, maybe drinking less. And that was something that was a major change in American society. All right, we're going to move topics. Number 28 on your study guide asks you about education. So in the 1830s, there was an argument that all children should go to school, and schools should be run by the government, and that's called public schools. That's what we're in. So for number 28, it says, why was Horace Mann important to the history of American education? So you're going to put for this one that Horace Mann was the guy who created the model for public education in Massachusetts, and this model spread all over the country. So you may wonder, what do I mean model? You have a teacher who's college educated. You have textbooks. You have a building where all kids get to go tuition free, that it's paid for by taxes. And that system was invented by this guy, Horace Mann. So he's sort of referred to as the father of public education. All right, let's change topics again. The next group of questions are all going to deal with slavery. I think there's about three of them. The next question says, 29, how did slavery end in northern states? So what I want you to know about this one is that slavery in northern states ended very gradually, very slowly over the span of several decades. So we're talking 10, 20, 30 years. So the South, they kept their slaves, but in the North, they wanted to get rid of their slaves, but they wanted to do it really slowly and really gradually. Okay? If we look at number 30 says, what percentage of the Northern population supported ending slavery in the early 1800s? For this question, you need to be aware that the number is small. So people who called themselves abolitionists, who wanted to see slavery end in the United States, they were a really teeny tiny portion of the northern population. So it's hard to estimate an exact number, but historians estimate that anywhere between 5 and 10% of northern people in the early 1800s argue that slavery should be ended immediately. So very small number, 5 to 10%. Make sure you have that on your study guide. Our last question about slavery here. Number 31. Why was Frederick Douglass, that name should ring a bell. Why was Frederick Douglass important to the anti-slavery movement? Okay. So Frederick Douglass has an interesting life story. He was a former slave in Maryland. He runs away. He gains his freedom. But once he gains his freedom, Frederick Douglass travels all around the country speaking to people and basically telling them how awful slavery was, but he's doing it from a firsthand perspective. And he basically goes down in history as the most well-known African-American person of pretty much the entire 1800s. So Frederick Douglass turns himself into like sort of a celebrity in that people hear and develop opinions about slavery based on what he tells them. So he's a runaway slave. He speaks about how bad slavery is, and he became the most well-known African-American person, basically of the 1800s. So know that about Frederick Douglass. All right, so our next question asks about a different movement. Now we're going to get away from slavery here. Let's talk about women. So the question for 32 says, what happened in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848? So what you want to put for this one is that in 1848, this was the location and time of the first women's rights convention ever held. Now, a lot of these women who showed up, they were not rookies. They knew what they were doing. These were women who fought against alcohol. These were women that fought against slavery. And for them, it got to a point where they kind of wondered, well, if we're fighting for all these other things, why aren't we fighting for ourselves? So what they did was they produced a document, and they all signed it, all the women and the men who were there, and they basically, for the first time, argued that men and women should be treated exactly the same. Women should be able to work jobs and pursue whatever kind of life they wanted. It took a long time for women to get rights, especially voting rights in the United States. But in 1848, this was where it all began. This is where the fight started. All right, now let's move to prisons. There's one question on your final exam about prison reform in the 1800s. So the key thing you want to know here says, for 33, in what ways did the woman Dorothea Dix reform prisons? Dorothea Dix's big contribution to prison reform was that she argued that there should be, you can use multiple words, but mental asylums or mental hospitals. And she argued that mentally ill people should not be sent to prison, that there should be special places where mentally ill people could be sent and receive medicine and not be harassed by other criminals. Okay, so this was a new idea, and it's something that still exists today, and that's Dorothea Dix's contribution to prison reform. Now, the last three questions for Chapter 8 all deal with immigration. Okay, so let's go through what we need to know about immigration. The group that we're really going to focus on is the Irish, because when the Irish came over, they really kind of changed the way that people thought about immigrants. So number 34 says, what caused large-scale Irish immigration to America in the 1840s? for this one, you're going to write in the Irish potato famine. Um, Poor people in Ireland ate potatoes. And in the 1840s, when the poor Irish people went to go dig up their potatoes, the potatoes were rotting and they could not eat them. So Irish people had to make the decision, stay in Ireland and starve to death, or move somewhere else like the United States and start a new life. But the key thing about the Irish here is that they were poor, and a lot of them couldn't read and write, and they didn't have a lot of skills. So when they came to America, Americans did not welcome them. Look, that moves us to number 35. What church did Irish immigrants belong to? Make sure for your final exam you know that Irish immigrants were Catholic. And in the 1840s, there were not too many Catholic people in the United States. Today there is, but not in the 1840s. So basically, it was viewed that if you're Catholic, you're not a true American, or you can't be a patriotic American because, those Catholic people, if you look up here on the screen, they do what the Pope tells them to do, and that's not the kind of thing that Americans listen to. So be aware that because the Irish were Catholic, that was one of the reasons why they weren't liked. Lastly, but not leastly, number 36 says, how were Irish immigrants viewed by native-born American people? Okay. Make sure you know that Irish immigrants were not welcomed. The Americans told them to go home. We don't want you here. And there were two reasons why Irish people were not welcomed. Number one, Irish people were accused of ruining American society. Like, you're coming over here, our country, all people in our country, act and do things a certain way, and you foreign people do things different. You're not welcome here. You're going to ruin the way that we run our country. So one was like societal. The other thing was that Americans argued that the Irish were ruining the economy. And they argued that, there's all these poor people coming over. They'll do any kind of work for any kind of pay. And, because they will come over here and do any work for any pay, all Americans are going to make less money. Now, Irish people did not ruin American society, and Irish immigrants did not ruin the American economy, but that did not stop American people from criticizing the Irish and not being that friendly to them. But to conclude here, over time, Irish people, settled in America. They got educated. They got money. They served in the military. And now today, we view Irish people just like any other Americans. And I think that's a lesson for like other immigrant groups and other immigrant groups that go through hard things, that sometimes it takes, unfortunately, Americans some time to adapt to new groups of people who come over. All right, guys. So good job. Make sure you have all your answers, and we'll do Chapter 9 tomorrow.